Miles Davis discovered Tony Williams when he was just 17 years old, a teenage drumming prodigy playing in Boston clubs who would revolutionize jazz rhythm. Miles took this unknown kid and made him the heartbeat of the greatest quintet in jazz history. But when Tony Williams left to form his own rock fusion band Lifetime, abandoning everything Miles had taught him, it felt like the ultimate betrayal. The confrontation that followed revealed the painful truth about mentorship, loyalty, and what happens when your greatest discovery becomes your biggest disappointment. It was December 1963, and Miles Davis was driving through Boston in a rented car, looking for new talent. At 37 years old, Miles was already a legend, but he was also a perfectionist who was constantly searching for musicians who could push his music into new territories. He had recently dissolved his previous quintet and was in the process of assembling what would become known as his second great quintet. Miles had heard rumors about a teenage drummer who was causing a stir in Boston's jazz scene. The kid was supposedly only 17 years old, but musicians who had heard him play were saying he had technique and creativity that rivaled players twice his age. That night, Miles walked into a small club in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood, expecting to hear another overhyped young musician who would disappoint him like so many others had. Instead, he witnessed something that would change the course of jazz history. Tony Williams was sitting behind a drum kit that looked almost too big for his slight teenage frame, but the sounds coming from his sticks were unlike anything Miles had ever heard. Tony was playing with a combination of bebop sophistication and rock power that had never been attempted before. His rhythmic concepts were so advanced that the other musicians on stage were struggling to keep up with him. Miles stood in the back of the club for 2 full sets, watching this kid create rhythmic patterns that were simultaneously complex and accessible, innovative and deeply groovy. Tony wasn't just playing drums, he was reimagining what drums could do in a jazz context. After the second set, Miles approached Tony with an offer that would change both their lives. "Kid," Miles said, his voice carrying that distinctive rasp that commanded immediate attention. "How would you like to come to New York and play with my quintet?" Tony looked up at Miles with a mixture of awe and excitement. Like every young jazz musician in America, Tony knew exactly who Miles Davis was and what an invitation to join his band meant. "Are you serious?" Tony asked, barely able to believe what he was hearing. "I don't joke about music," Miles replied. "You've got something special, and I want to see what we can create together." Within 2 weeks, Tony Williams had packed his belongings and moved to New York City. Miles had not only discovered a drummer, he had found the missing piece that would make his new quintet revolutionary. The chemistry between Tony and the other members of what would become the second great quintet was immediately apparent. With Wayne Shorter on saxophone, Herbie Hancock on piano, and Ron Carter on bass, Tony provided the rhythmic foundation that allowed the entire group to explore new musical territories. But Tony wasn't just the youngest member of the band, he became Miles's protege in the truest sense. Miles took a personal interest in Tony's development, not just as a musician, but as a young man navigating the complex world of professional jazz. Miles included Tony in decisions about repertoire, arrangements, and artistic direction. He made sure Tony received proper credit and compensation for his contributions to the band. Most importantly, he treated Tony like family, inviting him to his home, introducing him to other musicians, and serving as a mentor who went far beyond the typical bandleader-sideman relationship. Over the next 5 years, from 1963 to 1968, the Miles Davis Quintet with Tony Williams created some of the most innovative and influential music in jazz history. Albums like ESP, Miles Smiles, Sorcerer, and Nefertiti showcased Tony's revolutionary drumming style and demonstrated how his rhythmic concepts were pushing the entire band toward new levels of creativity. Tony's drumming was the engine that powered the quintet's exploration of time, space, and rhythm. He could play with bebop sophistication when the music called for it, but he could also create rock-influenced grooves that gave the band's music an accessibility and power that traditional jazz had never achieved. Miles watched with pride as Tony developed from a talented teenager into one of the most important drummers in jazz history. But he also began to notice changes in Tony's attitude and ambitions that would eventually lead to heartbreak. By 1968, Tony was no longer the wide-eyed 17-year-old who had been grateful for Miles's mentorship. He was now 22 years old, an established artist in his own right, and increasingly interested in exploring musical directions that extended beyond Miles's artistic vision. Tony had become fascinated with rock music, particularly the power and commercial potential of bands like Cream and Jimi Hendrix Experience. He began to see jazz as artistically satisfying but commercially limited, especially compared to the huge audiences and financial success that rock musicians were achieving. The tension came to a head during a recording session in early 1969. Miles was working on material that would eventually become the album In a Silent Way, exploring a more electric and rock-influenced direction. But instead of seeing this as an opportunity to develop their collaboration further, Tony saw it as confirmation that he needed to pursue his own musical vision. After the session, Tony approached Miles with news that would devastate the bandleader. "Miles," Tony said, his voice carrying a determination that Miles had never heard before, "I need to tell you something. I'm leaving the quintet." Miles felt the words hit him like a physical blow. Tony wasn't just his drummer, he was the musician Miles had discovered, nurtured, and developed. Losing Tony felt like losing a son. "What are you talking about?" Miles asked, his voice showing the first signs of the anger and hurt that would soon overwhelm him. "I'm forming my own band," Tony continued. "I'm calling it Lifetime. We're going to play a fusion of jazz and rock that will reach new audiences and create new possibilities for the music." Miles stared at Tony in disbelief. This was the kid he had discovered in a Boston club, brought to New York, and made into one of the most respected drummers in jazz. Now Tony was walking away from everything they had built together. "Tony," Miles said, his voice tight with emotion, "everything you are as a musician, you owe to this band. I discovered you when you were nobody. I brought you to New York. I made you part of the most important quintet in jazz history. And now you're going to abandon all of that for some rock band." Tony felt the sting of Miles's words, but he was determined to pursue his own artistic vision. "Miles, I'm grateful for everything you've done for me," Tony said, "but I can't stay in your shadow forever. I need to explore my own musical ideas and create my own identity as an artist." The conversation that followed was one of the most painful in Miles's career. He accused Tony of ingratitude, of betraying the trust and investment that had been made in his development. He suggested that Tony was abandoning artistic integrity for commercial success. "You're making a mistake," Miles said, his voice filled with disappointment and anger. "You're throwing away everything we've created together for some fantasy about rock stardom. You're going to regret this decision for the rest of your career." Tony tried to explain that his decision wasn't about rejecting Miles's mentorship or the value of their collaboration. He was simply ready to explore his own artistic vision and create music that reflected his own musical interests and ambitions. But Miles couldn't hear Tony's explanation as anything other than betrayal. To Miles, Tony's departure felt like the ultimate act of ingratitude, abandoning the person who had made his career possible in favor of pursuing commercial success. The breakup became official in early 1969. When Tony left the Miles Davis Quintet to form Lifetime with guitarist John McLaughlin and organist Larry Young. The band pursued exactly the kind of jazz-rock fusion that Tony had described to Miles, combining sophisticated jazz improvisation with rock power and commercial appeal. Initially, it seemed like Tony's gamble might pay off. Lifetime generated significant buzz in the music industry and attracted attention from rock audiences who had never been interested in traditional jazz. The band's music was innovative and powerful, demonstrating that Tony's musical vision had been legitimate. But the success was short-lived. Lifetime struggled to find a consistent audience, caught between jazz fans who found their music too rock-influenced and rock fans who found it too complex and experimental. The band went through multiple lineup changes and never achieved the commercial breakthrough that Tony had hoped for. Meanwhile, Miles continued to explore electric and rock-influenced directions with his new musicians, creating groundbreaking albums like Bitches Brew and On the Corner that proved he was perfectly capable of evolving his music without Tony's contributions. The personal relationship between Miles and Tony remained strained for years. Miles felt that Tony had abandoned him at a crucial moment in his artistic development, just as he was beginning to explore the electric directions that would define his music in the 1970s. Tony felt that Miles couldn't accept his need for artistic independence and personal growth. The tragedy of their conflict was that both men were essentially right. Tony had legitimate reasons for wanting to explore his own musical vision and establish his own artistic identity, but Miles also had legitimate reasons for feeling betrayed by someone he had discovered, nurtured, and treated like family. In interviews during the 1970s, Miles would often reference Tony's departure as one of the most disappointing experiences of his career. He felt that Tony had been ungrateful and short-sighted, abandoning a successful collaboration for the uncertain promise of commercial success. Tony, for his part, always acknowledged the crucial role that Miles had played in his development as a musician, but he maintained that his decision to leave the quintet had been necessary for his growth as an artist and his exploration of new musical territories. The reconciliation between Miles and Tony came gradually, over many years. By the 1980s, both men had gained enough perspective to understand the complex dynamics that had led to their painful separation. Miles came to realize that Tony's departure had been inevitable, that talented young musicians naturally outgrow their mentors and need to establish their own artistic identities. Tony came to understand that his leaving had genuinely hurt Miles, who had invested not just professional, but personal energy in their relationship. In a 1985 interview, Miles offered a more mature perspective on Tony's departure. Tony was a great drummer, and he needed to explore his own music. I was hurt when he left, but I understand now that it was something he had to do. You can't keep people in a box, even if it's a successful box. Tony, in his own interviews, always credited Miles as the most important influence on his development as a musician. Miles discovered me when I was just a kid and gave me the opportunity to play with the best musicians in the world. Everything I learned about music, I learned from that experience. Even when I left to form Lifetime, I was using concepts and approaches that I had developed playing with Miles. The story of Miles's discovery of Tony Williams and their subsequent breakup became a classic example of the complex dynamics between mentors and protégés in the music world. It demonstrated both the power of mentorship to transform young talent and the inevitable tensions that arise when protégés outgrow their mentor's vision. Looking back, it's clear that both Miles and Tony benefited from their relationship, even though it ended painfully. Miles discovered one of the most important drummers in jazz history and helped create some of the most innovative music of the 1960s. Tony received the training and exposure that allowed him to become a major figure in jazz and fusion music. The lesson from their relationship is that mentorship involves both the joy of discovering and developing talent and the pain of watching that talent eventually choose its own path. The greatest mentors are those who can take pride in their protégé's success, even when that success leads them away from the original relationship. Miles Davis's discovery of Tony Williams remains one of the most important talent discoveries in jazz history. Even though their personal relationship was complicated by questions of loyalty and gratitude, their musical collaboration produced innovations that influenced generations of musicians and expanded the possibilities of what jazz could become. The pain that Miles felt when Tony left was real and understandable. But ultimately, the music they created together became more important than the personal hurt. Their collaboration demonstrated that even relationships that end in disappointment can produce art that lasts forever. If this complex story of mentorship, discovery, and the bittersweet nature of artistic relationships inspired you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell Share this video with someone who understands the complicated dynamics between mentors and those they help develop. Have you ever experienced the pain of watching someone you nurtured choose a different path? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to check out more stories about the personal costs and rewards of discovering and developing talent in the music world.